Well, a Methodist gets to talk to the Nazarenes. You know, that's a good thing. At least you all do know who John Wesley is. And so we're talking on somewhat of a similar foundation here. I was intrigued when I heard the story about one of my books being, mailed out to everybody. I just wish there were more of you. But you hear various things when you go around as people, seek to introduce you or say something nice, etc. I was in Amarillo, Texas. It's been 3 or 4 years ago, and was speaking to a large group. And before I started, folks were kind of gathered out in a large narthex area before we came in the sanctuary, and I was to talk. And this young man came up to me. He was about 30. And he was just very excited. I mean, you would have thought I was like, some great sports hero or something. And he said, "Oh, I'm so happy to meet you. I'm so excited to meet you, and this is just great. And could you sign my book, please?" And he had it, and I signed that book. He said, "Well, I've got 2 more of your books," and I signed them. And he said, "This is just so great. I can't believe I'm getting to meet you." And I'm like, "God, I wish my wife got this enthused, And he went on, and he said, "I'll tell you, I've been reading this book. This book has just changed my life." And I said, "Well," I said, "thank you so much." And he said, I'm the financial secretary of my church. And he said, "It's changing my church. I'm talking to him." I said, "Well, that's wonderful, and thank you." He said, "I have been sitting up at night reading this to my wife before we go to bed." And I thought, "You have got to be kidding." I said, "You're reading a financial stewardship book to your wife at night?" "Yeah." I said, "How's that working out for you?" He said, "Not very good." I said, "Yeah, I would just keep that to yourself." I said, "My wife doesn't like it when I read my books to her, at night. Don't do that." But I thank you for the introduction. I thank you all for the time, and it is good to be with you. I concur with the concerns that have been expressed. Not that because you're not the only ones experiencing it in the Church of the Nazarene. We work intimately with a large number of denominations, and the financial strain, the financial stress on the clergy and upon those denominations is massive. Pension programs are literally frightened as to what they see, not just within yours, but in other denominations coming down the track. Lauren Mead of the Alban Institute wrote a book not all that long ago called "Meltdown in the Main Line." that he felt like we were about at the point to where we weren't going to be able to stop it. It was simply going to implode. I agree with his concerns, but I hate to think that it's at a point of meltdown. I hate to think that we cannot reverse things and turn it around. But what I know for certain, and what I have been trying to share around the country with all that I get a chance to meet with, we have got to learn how to do financial stewardship differently within our churches than we've done it. We have done financial stewardship in our local churches the same way for the last 50 years. And I would say to you, as I said to that young man reading the book, how's that working out for you? We're still getting poorer and poorer results, and yet we continue to try to do the same thing. The church used to receive 60% of all charitable contributions in America. Today it's 31%. We've lost 1/2 of our market share. Gone. Now, if you were running a business and you had lost 1/2 of your market share, would you be concerned? Would you say something is wrong? If I've already lost half, where will it be in 4 years, 5 years, 10 years? I'm afraid the curve is not in our favor. It's been interesting to me as I have studied this to look and see who we compare to. The market share loss of the church's financial resources compares very favorably to the market share loss of General Motors. When you look at where General Motors used to be as the #1 selling car brand in all the world, they used to sell 60% of all the cars. And they began to lose market share. And yet, as I look at it, and it appears that on the inside of the boardrooms at General Motors, when folks said, we've lost some market share, they refused to make the adjustments necessary because they continued to believe that simply saying to persons, but this is a General Motors car, would be enough. That people will never flock to something made in Japan. They may try it out, but they'll come back because we are General Motors. And their grandfather bought General Motors, and their father bought General Motors, and they will be back. And they didn't come back. And not too long ago, as you know, they appeared in front of Congress and said, we've lost so much market share, General Motors Corporation is going to declare bankruptcy and we're dead. Unless you can bail us out. Congress did bail them out with billions of dollars. General Motors has since changed dramatically, recovered, begun to come back. Thank goodness. I'm delighted for that. But they were almost dead and buried in the ground. Now, we can sit back and let it continue to happen, and maybe some of you illustrious folks can go before Congress and say, the Church of the Nazarene's about to be dead unless you bail us out. I don't think Congress is going to give you a dime. They're going to just let you go ahead and put up the tombstone. If we're going to reverse it, we're going to have to change it ourselves. About 4 years ago, I was in this city, and I was visiting with, it wasn't 4 years, probably 6 years ago. I was visiting with the pastor of a church where he and I were going to be putting together the team for a capital campaign. Now, I had worked with this pastor. I'd gone over the list. I'd studied all the patterns and the people, and I said, this looks like a good lineup to succeed with this campaign. Pastor, you need to invite these persons to come in and meet with us, 30 minutes each. Let's do it on these 2 days. You and I'll sit in your office and we'll get this done. His job was to invite them to take a certain job, turn to me to explain it. I was to explain it, and then we hoped to get a yes. Now, the lady who was due in next to visit with us was a lady that I thought was a slam dunk. Easy as can be to get on this committee. She had chaired the board of this church on 2 separate occasions. She and her husband had been members for over 20 years. They were the second leading donors to this congregation. This woman was a church groupie. She wasn't going to tell the preacher no. She's going to do this. So, seeing she was on the list next, I said to the pastor, bring her in, introduce us quickly, get through this, tell her what you'd like for her to do. I'll take a couple of minutes, explain the job to her. She'll say yes, she'll leave here. You and I'll have another cup of coffee. This is going to be a piece of cake. Well, she came in. She's a nice lady, and I met her. She sat in a chair right across from me. The pastor sat off to my right. He did what I told him. He quickly said, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much. I'm really hoping that you'll consider taking this particular job in our upcoming campaign. Clif's going to explain that to you. I took a few minutes and explained the job, just enough where I thought she'll hear enough to be comfortable and say yes. Waited for her answer. I noticed her body language. When she sat down, initially, she was seated kind of on the edge of what was a love seat. I don't know why pastors have love seats in their office, but they do. And he was seated there. She was there. When it was her time to speak, she pushed back into the seat, leaned back, and crossed her legs as if to say, I'm here to stay a while. And my initial thought was, this is not good. She looked at her pastor. Pastor, I thank you for having me here. My husband and I are always happy to consider helping. We're honored that you've asked us to serve in in some way. As you know, we've served in a number of ways in our church. We certainly do love the church. And we've always tried to be faithful in everything that we could do. And it's flattering, you would think, of us, again, as the church gets ready to embark on this venture. So I thank you for that. And certainly I've known this was coming from various meetings that we've had. My husband and I sat down the other night and kind of began to talk about it. He knew I was coming in here to see you today. And we simply began to discuss the church and what we certainly know would be the responsibility of anybody who's asked to serve in leadership. Pastor, I want you to know that a year and a half ago, my husband and I began to support World Vision and Oxfam. And we've gotten very excited about those two organizations. Why, you know, what they're doing around the world is just unbelievable. I mean, the information that we have gotten and what we have seen and the response to our gifts. Why, in Africa right now, it's unbelievable the number of persons that depend on their meal every single day coming from one of those organizations. And over in Asia, and she simply talked for just... Anyway, we've really been very, very excited about what we see there. Now, as we were talking together about our excitement about what's being done there, we started to reflect upon the church. She said, you know, as I look around Sunday morning, it seems like we have less people here this Sunday than we did, or this year than we did last year. I remember when almost every Sunday there was just a whole flock of children would run down to the front for children's time. And gosh, Pastor, it took us a while to even find children last Sunday in church. Why, most of the people who seem to be coming now have either no hair or gray hair. Pastor, when was the last time that we had a baptism? All of this simply got us thinking, Pastor, can you tell us why you think it is that the church is the best place for us to give our money? And when she asked him that question, I pushed back in my seat. Said, this is going to be good. Well, this pastor was a very nice man. And he had just had a very heavy question laid right at his feet. And I looked to him to answer the question. Why is it the church is the best place to give my money? And he squirmed around a little, and then he said, now, he said, first, I want you to know how much I think of you and how much I value you and you and your husband. You're right. You have been so faithful. You have done everything we've ever asked you to do. Why, I've never hesitated to call upon you, and I just owe you great thanks for all that you have done and meant to our church. You've just been wonderful. Absolutely, you've been wonderful. And I thank you so much for that. And I'm grateful that you felt like you could share with me that you're giving your money in some other places. That's okay. I understand. I truly do. I know those two organizations. Fine organizations. Nothing wrong with them. Not at all. They're good and wonderful. And I am not at all upset. You need to know I am not at all upset that you have chosen to do that. That's okay with me. That's fine. I'm just glad you felt like you could share it. And it's good to know. It really is. And I even give some to other things in the church sometimes myself. And I understand you're doing that, and I really do. And this question that you ask, it's a good question. It really is. And I think Clif could help us here. And I was like, I felt like I was just sitting over here on the bench, and all of a sudden they tossed me the ball. I mean, whoa, I didn't even know I was in this game. And I knew she didn't want to hear from me. She didn't want to hear from me. She knew I was there for just a short haul. I was not going to be the one to lead and guide this church or direct it going forward. And yet I was the one supposed to answer the question. I fumbled around. I took a couple of minutes and I thought, well, the church is the body of Christ. And, she was kind of very polite, very nice, and finished. I got done. She stood up. We stood up. And she said, well, thank you again, Pastor, for asking me. And so nice to meet you, sir. And, well, let me think on this. And she said, I'll talk with my husband. And, Pastor, I will call you by tomorrow and give you my answer. And she left. Pastor and I are left standing in his office. He looks at me and he says, well, you think she'll serve? I said, Lord, no. I said, she's turning you down. She's not going to do it. And he just kind of sat there. I said, but what that woman just did for you, she posed the question to you that you have got to learn to answer. Why are you deserving of this money? Why should it come to you? She has multiple opportunities. Why should she pick you? And if you don't learn how to answer that and how to voice it and how to express it, you're not going to succeed in this campaign. And he listened and kind of took a step or two back and he said, well, okay. Would you folks at Horizons have a template for that? He wanted us to provide him a template for why his church was deserving of what God had given to her. I said, no, we don't. Oh, okay. That man never did learn how to answer that question. He never did. That campaign got some contributions, but it got very few commitments. We have got to learn to answer that question. Why should they give to you? Not why should they give. We've sold that fairly well. Most of our folks would say, well, the Christian life is a giving life. We should give. But where they are today and going faster and faster is questioning why should it therefore come to us? And that's what we haven't learned to answer. That's what we haven't learned to answer. You need to understand that you are in a competitive environment. And it's not that you're competing against the Baptists and the Methodists and the Lutherans and the Independents. You're competing against 1.5 million nonprofits in America who are making their case. Making their case. Just like the story you heard earlier at the university, they're making their case. And our people have become more and more and more used to hearing the case. That you're not just giving because it's got a sticker on it that says General Motors or church, but because lives are being changed, and here's exactly how. And they're making that case, and they're making it to the folks sitting in your pews. And those folks are choosing to give their money elsewhere. Why should they give to you? If you've read any of my books, and if you hadn't, they're all out there. I hope you buy every one of them. Take them all. Take a hint, buy one, and give it to every member of your congregation. If you've read any, you have heard me talk about our having an understanding of why people give. Now imagine that we should understand why people give. Our mission, our ministry is dependent upon people choosing to give to us. I don't know if you've noticed, but you can't impose a tax on them anymore. No pew taxes in America. They've got to choose to give to you. And what they've been saying to us in the last 30 years is, we're not picking you nearly as often. So why are they picking where they're picking? That would seem to make good sense. What America says to us, the top 3 reasons why it is they choose to give today. The number one reason overwhelmingly that stands up in survey after survey after survey is they are giving where they have belief in the mission being done. Now, that depends upon their understanding of what your mission is. An awful lot of our churches fail because they frankly cannot articulate a common mission. And if I show up in your church and I would go around in your hallways on Sunday and stop people and say, what's the mission of this church? Would I hear 10 same answers from 10 straight people? Or would I hear 10 different answers? Why don't they even understand what we're to be about? How do we articulate our success? How do we articulate what we're doing if they have no idea what we're trying to be and do? A belief in the mission is the number one reason. And what they're saying when they say that is, we're giving where we see lives being changed. My friend Jim said clearly to me that he had a Christian reason for giving. He was a steward of the Lord God Almighty. And he thought God was more at work in the art department of the secular university than he did in his church. Now, he didn't say it just like that, but he talked clearly about wanting to change the lives of young people, and he had been convinced by the chancellor of that university that lives would effectively be changed in a way that my friend valued. And he sat and talked to me about it. He said, you know, they're going to finish there, and they're going to go out into the world, and they're going to be planted in various places, and they're going to, I mean, he was just effusive in excitement as to how he saw them making this a better world. He did not see or understand that from his church. So the church got a contribution, and the university got a commitment. I shared a story in one of my books about really a transformative event in my life nearly 12, 13 years ago of listening to a young 42-year-old attorney talk about why he was giving $1.5 million to the Boys and Girls Club. And he was an active member of his church. It was mentioned in his introduction. I knew the church and I knew the Boys Club. What I didn't know was this donor. So I made an appointment with him. I went up to his office. I sat down. And in the midst of that, as he was talking about his life and his money, and I remember him telling me, he said, I'm worth $15 million. He said to me. And the last thing in the world God wants to hear from me on that judgment day is, hey, God, I'm worth $15 million. He will look at me and say, I know. Where do you think that came from? So tell me what you did. That's what God's going to ask me. This is the testimony I'm getting from this young man. I'm thinking, preach it, brother. Preach it. And I said to him as he kept talking about his enthusiasm and excitement for the Boys and Girls Club and how they were changing the lives of these inner city kids, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, would you ever consider making a gift like this to your church? And he looked at me and he said, Lord, no. They wouldn't know what to do with it. Whoa. You could have hit me with a 2 before and I wouldn't have been any more stunned. They wouldn't know what to do with it. And so I just came back at him and I said, so you mean to tell me you believe this singular boys club on this corner is really changing the lives of more young people than your church is? And he looked at me and said, well, of course. course. So I said, well, do you give to your church? And his answer to that was, better than most. He made contributions, but not a commitment. The commitment was going elsewhere where he saw lives being changed. People want to know how we're changing lives. We're the best kept secret in America. We don't tell our story. You want proof of that? You just decide to go on the websites of any Church of the Nazarene you want. Just sit up one night and punch them in there. Look at their website and see what's on their homepage. See if on that homepage is anybody sharing a testimony of how life was changed because of their involvement with that church. What jumps out at you? You know what's on most of them? A picture of the building. Because that's who we are to America. We're buildings. And everybody wants to give for more buildings. So we put our building front and center. You go to other successful nonprofit websites, and what's on their homepage, you will see a testimony and a story of life that has been changed in and around the mission they're involved in. They get it. They know why people give. At every bit of their communications, all that they send out is telling their story of how lives are being changed. And we're putting the preacher's picture there or a picture of the building. Because we know folks can't wait to join a church that's got a pretty preacher like that. What's that saying about your mission? How's that helping anybody want to give to you? The second chief reason why it is that Americans say they give is their regard for staff, and particularly the head staff, the CEO, the president, the chancellor, or in our case, the pastor. It was interesting to me in the story that Jim was telling about why he gave $6 million, that very quickly he said, in all of my conversations with the chancellor was sharing with me. The chancellor was doing this. In my conversations with the young attorney that gave $1.5 million, he was saying, as I visited with the executive director, and we talked about da-da-da-da-da-da-da. These persons understand that simply building a building doesn't change lives. People change lives. They gave that money, the $6 million, the $1.5 million, to a person who had convinced them, I have the ability to make happen that which you have the ability to fund. Together we can get this vision done. The number one fundraiser at every university in America is the chancellor or the president of that university, not the advancement department. Some of them got hundreds of people in development departments in advance. They are not. It is the president who must be there to close the deals, because all of the others can only look at the donor and say, you want to get this done. If you'll give me this money, they're like the car dealer. I'll run talk to my boss and see if we can close the deal. You know how much you love that. And they hesitate. You're saying that this money will go to this, but I don't know if you can pull that off or not. But if you're the head person, then I have the confidence to make the gift that you can do it. That's what we need to do. And yet in America today, only 26% of all the clergy even have a clue as to who their donors are. 74% don't even know. And we think that's smart. That's stupid. Do I need to spell that? It's stupid. It doesn't serve the mission. It doesn't serve the kingdom that our head person is not in many cases even able to go up to a major donor and say thank you, because the church doesn't let them know. Every other nonprofit thanked that person for that gift, except for the church that acted haughty and arrogant in the face of it and said nothing. I cannot tell you the hundreds of donors that I have worked with that have looked at me and said, I learned right then and there, they don't appreciate what you do. I gave to 8, 9, 10 nonprofits. I got thank you letters, invitations to lunch, appreciations galore. I gave 10 times that to my church, and they didn't do anything but send me a computer printout. I think I'm going to give more to Oxfam and World Vision. That's where America is today. And we have set ourselves up for failure and refuse for some reason to change. For stupid, idiotic reasons. You know, I go into church. Why do you have a rule your pastor can't know the donors of this church? That he can thank somebody. Why don't you put a blindfold on him on Sunday so he won't see who's singing in the choir, that he could really thank them for that solo? We wouldn't want the pastor to do that. How dumb is that? But what they say to me is something like, well, we want our preacher to treat everybody equally. Any of y'all ever heard that? How many preachers in here treat their members equally? That's what I thought. That was the right answer. And why don't you? Why don't you treat them equally? How many of them are equal? None of them. None of them. Some of them are well and some of them are sick. Some of them are old and some of them are young. A preacher's job is not to treat people equally. A preacher's job is to help people on their journey to become like Christ. And you take them wherever you find them. And you begin to work with them like that. That's our job. That's what we do. And if we can understand how they have chosen to part with that which they love, in many cases more than God, we get a strong indicator of their spiritual development and what we need to do as their pastor to help them grow. There is no stronger diagnostic tool of spiritual development than how somebody gives. None. You cannot love Jesus Christ and not give. You cannot do it. You cannot do it. And if you look at somebody who's in your church and they're not giving, you can't read their heart exactly, but I guarantee you, you're not going to find a person in love with Jesus. You're going to find a person that needs their pastor to work with them to know Jesus. And you know that by what you have seen. Just like you would know it if they said, oh, I love Jesus, but I hadn't been to church in 3 years. Really? And we don't need to talk to you about your church attendance ought to go up. We need to really wrestle about your spiritual development. And you do that because you know their church attendance. We need to know what our people give if we're going to be able to compete in this marketplace. It is not helpful to the kingdom for us to do that. And finally, I would say to you, America says to us they give where they see fiscal responsibility. Belief in the mission, regard for staff, and fiscally responsible. So what are they saying? We give to successful things. We want to give to ships that leave one port and arrive at another. We don't want to support sinking ships. We want our money to get good use. We want to feel like we're getting bang for our buck. And we're going to give where we see that. We don't want to throw our money away. So if you're always saying to us, we're almost broke, we're beginning to lose heart in you because we get solicited by dozens of organizations and you're the only one keeps saying you're almost broke. Only one. We've kind of decided maybe we need to start giving a little less to you and give more to Habitat for Humanity or the Boys and Girls Club or the Y or to something else. We don't get those letters from them. They just keep telling us how they're changing lives. And you send us letters that said, well, we just came out of those difficult summer months. We find ourselves 8.5% behind in the budget. We need $32,000 to arrive shortly, or we're going to have to make major cuts and end programs or let staff go. So we hope everybody will dig deep and give a little more to help bail us out so we can pay off our denominational obligations again. So if you would take a look at what you have and give us about 8.6% more, maybe we can get there. And remember, God loves a cheerful giver. That's the kind of garbage they get from us. And we're wondering, why don't they give? Others say, we're really doing really well as a church, so we've quit sending out letters about that so that nobody knows. Because they give you a lot more when they think you're broke. And that's wrong. They don't. They don't. The record shows it. They want to give to successful institutions, not to ones who are always broke. Sunday morning for so many churches is like, folks, we want you to know, here's the rat hole. Please take your wallets out and throw it in this rat hole. That's sort of what it is. Instead, what they need to hear is, folks, let me let you hear from John Jones. And John shares a story of how Jesus Christ has changed his life. And the church needs to say, folks, we want to change dozens of lives like John, and that's what you're giving to. And this morning we hope you'll give generously and change lives like that. Not we can't pay the light bill. We've sent a message out that we're fiscally irresponsible even when we have been responsible because for some stupid reason we thought it was a good idea. It's a dumb idea. Don't do that. I know there's some Methodist churches, probably not any Nazarene, but there's some Methodist churches will actually put their financial information in a newsletter or a bulletin. Oh yeah. We expected to get, actually got, and the amount we're behind. Because they know half the community has been looking for a bankrupt church to join. So they want to make sure they get it front and center. That is a stupid idea. No nonprofit would do that. But we've suddenly decided the more we show them we're behind. I was in a church the other day, they actually printed their deficit in red ink. Whole bulletin was black ink, but this one, we're behind $32,614. And I'm a visitor there. I'm thinking, well, thank God for that, because I was wondering where to give my $32,000 this morning, and now I know it's you. No, I'm sitting here thinking this is the last Sunday I want to show up here. Because I got an idea what they want from me. And frankly, they're more broke than I am. Don't do that. It sends a message of fiscal irresponsibility, even though we know that 95% of all churches are behind all year long until December. But we want to go ahead and print it thinking that somehow it does us some good. It does not. Folks, my time is about up. But yours is too. We've got to change our culture of financial stewardship. We've got to start responding to why it is people give. Instead of meeting with your finance team in your church next week and trying to decide, well, what are we going to cut? Have a conversation. How well do we tell our story about how lives are being changed and the missions being done here? How well are we using our pastor and our staff to communicate and work with the people who give the money that drives our ministry and mission? And are we communicating that we're fiscally responsible or irresponsible with what we're doing here? You get those three fixed, you might fix a lot of the rest of it. Absolutely. I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
So I spent my first 4 years of ministry in a homeless shelter. People were hungry, they were sick, they were desperately in need, and they came in and received help every single night. Easy to tell stories like that. Last 20 years I've been spending ministry in the local church where people don't want to show their needs, they don't want to show their brokenness, they don't want to show their weaknesses. How do you communicate without putting everyone's junk out on the table? How lives are being changed when a lot of people don't want to reveal their brokenness?
Well, one, every story doesn't have to be a story of brokenness because your mission is larger than just healing wounds. You have a mission in the local church to educate the young in the faith. Can there be a story that simply came out of Sunday school, that one young person responded in response to a Sunday school lesson that began to show they're getting it? They understand that we can share. Now, I would hope that the church would have stories of saved marriages and recovered alcoholics and a variety of broken needs that we have healed. And I would hope that they would be so grateful and thankful that they might be open to sharing that. We obviously can't make them do that, but we've got to try to establish a culture by which we as the body of Christ and loving individuals can express to one another that we love you in the midst of being broken. There can be nothing stronger happen in a church than those kind of testimonies, and others who are sitting there know they're broken too, and they see love expressed, etc. That then opens that up. When that begins to happen, you will have to control how many want to share, not where do I find them. But we simply have to learn to do it. And one of the things we do at Horizons when we're working with churches, we have taught all of them that we want to have a Sunday where you do cardboard testimonies, that you write the old life, enslaved to money or alcohol or whatever, flip it over. Now I've been freed in Christ. Broken by a failed marriage, healed by new love, not saying a word, just doing that. And that's a little easier than speaking, but when that's over and watching people come up out of pews and embrace these folks, opens it up saying it's going to be okay for me to be real too. So that's where we need to go so they can see the relevance of what we do.
Others? And panel members, jump in on some of that as well. Your own experience in what we're doing and the stories you were telling of local churches as a part of that very issue.
One of the most powerful testimonies I ever heard was we had a pattern of having lay people receive the offering, and then we worked with them that it would all be in a minute and a half, but they would share a reason why they were supporting our local church, and then they would receive and pray for the offering. And you always receive the offering, you never take it. Had a lady who said, most of you know me, I've been in the church a long time. My husband, isn't a Christian, but I'm the one that changed, not him. I wasn't a Christian when he married me. I'm the one who changed, he didn't. And I work and he works. And then I thought she said, he gives me permission, which I thought was an interesting statement, but she said, he gives me permission to tithe my salary. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that he lets me do that because I'm the one who wants to give this money, not him. And then she said, if you notice, sometimes I wear my dresses a little bit longer. They're a little bit out of style, or if you come to my house, you'll see that I don't have the newest sofa, and I drive my car as long as I can. And then she told a story about a little girl who'd given her teacher a seashell, and maybe know the story. The teacher says, wow, did your family go to the beach? And she said, no, I walked to the beach and got it for you. She said, well, that's like 10 miles. And she said, well, the walk was part of the gift. And so that Sunday morning, she said, the reason that I give is because Christ has changed my life so drastically, so radically. I would rather do without in order to support the kingdom. And I'm grateful for my husband who lets me do that. Probably one of the most powerful testimonies I'd heard in my whole life, and she told it herself.
Great.
So since we're talking about testimony, maybe I'll share about how that works in the congregation I'm pastoring, because there's a space for testimony every Sunday, even though it's not necessarily, it's not like I say, and now it's time for the testimonies. And I'm in a smaller congregation, so, I'm mindful that this may not work in your context, but there's always space and announcements for anyone to share an announcement. And often, life announcements are some how linked to, we might say prayer requests or concerns, and our children even participate. It's sometimes like I scored a goal in my soccer game yesterday. To our families walking in the autism walk again this year, we'd love to have you join us on Team Seth. But because that space is a part of every single worship service, I've found that testimonies will seep in and blow us away. I'm thinking of this last year on Father's Day. I get emotional every time I think about it. But, this space is just a part of service, and a single mother piped up, and I had just no idea she was going to say this, and she just said, well, today's Father's Day. I just want you to know I'm so glad my son has known what it's like to have a father because of the relationships he has with you all. And it was a testimony to the work of our church, not in any way that's maybe measurable, in the way that like a soup kitchen is, or this number of people were fed, but she's saying my son's life is different because of this church, and because of that space being built into worship every Sunday, we're constantly being reminded of the ways that the work of this local church is changing the lives of the people sitting right here.
Outstanding. Good. Yes.
Hi, my name is Montague Williams. I serve at Eastern Nazarene College, and just wanted to raise a question, or first just make a comment to Clif. Clif, I really appreciated a great deal of what you shared. I think for a lot of us in the room, there was probably a great deal of amens coming as you were talking about the importance of sharing the mission and letting the story of changed lives just be at the heart of our discussion of giving. And as someone who does have a background in working in faith-based nonprofit as well, I do think it's true. Somehow we have such a gap between the way we tell these stories. There was a moment when in the midst of your sharing where you told a bit about who here treats their members equally, and no one responded. And then you went on to explain, well, that's true. That makes sense. We don't treat our members equally. I think that was an interesting moment. I think your response to that raised some question for me, and I want to explain a little bit about that and then ask you a bit about this. So in many ways, it seemed like you were affirming that it makes sense to not treat members equally because they give differently, and that similar to some nonprofits, it would make sense to highlight those who give more and thank them publicly because they give more. And I don't know how many people I'm speaking for, I know for some, it made us feel a little uncomfortable. Because so while we do need to learn from nonprofits that do this, there is something distinct about being the church. And so a question can raise for many, how can we learn from this, but how can we be distinctly church in the way we respond? And so it leaves me wondering, I think about stories like, about the widow's mite, and I think it does make sense to acknowledge the way in which people give, but it certainly seems like it would be a problem in the church to highlight those who give more as if they are more important, and as if they deserve more respect and more care and more acknowledgement. It seems like we do something different in the way we go about this kind of acknowledgement. And I just want to give you an opportunity to speak more about that so that we don't go away and throwing out everything you said because of something that seemed problematic. I'd like to just give a chance for you to just reflect on that theologically for us here at NTS. Thank you.
Well, number one, you never heard me say that you should treat people who give more differently. Jesus seemed to obviously say, as he looked at the widow's mite, he knew exactly what she was giving, a greater proportion of what she had than any of the others who gave far more, and to her, he gave the blessing. Jesus knew who the stewards were. It's the stewards that we need to learn in our church, not the top 10 donors, but who are the top 10 stewards? That may well be school teachers or janitors or whatever else. But these persons have learned something about the kingdom and in their relationship with Christ, that what they're giving reflects that. That's our mission. Our mission's not amounts of money. Our mission is to change the world through bringing Jesus into the hearts of people. I had much rather have chairing my finance committee the janitor who sweeps out the bank and gives a tithe of his income than the head of the bank who may give 3 times what the janitor does, but it amounts to 1% or so of his income. I don't want that person. He may know more about money, but the janitor knows more about Jesus. But my knowing what they give enables me to treat them both in the best possible way to enable their spiritual development. So because I know what they gave, I'm able to say to the janitor, we need your help in spiritual stewardship leadership in our church. We need your example. You've learned something about giving. I want your spirit shared. Now, you're the number 82nd largest donor to our church. But as an amount of what it is you seem to have and what you're bringing, I've been overcome as I want that shared. To the head of the bank, who may be a top 10 giver, I don't need to invite him onto my finance committee, which most churches do. I need to spend time sitting with him talking about his relationship with Christ, not setting him up to be an example of how to give. I made that decision to treat them differently because of the relationship I perceive they have with the Lord, not because of the amounts of money they gave. The amount of money was a diagnostic tool that said, you know, I think my hunches of what I've seen in other ways are correct. You know Jesus, you may not. Does that help you any?
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about that a little further, reflect on that theologically. I think that's important. You know, and it just leads me to think of things like taking people out to special lunches, you know, those who give. And it's not often the case that the person who gives a great proportion of what they make, even if it's small, it's not always the case that they get that kind of acknowledgement. So I just wanted to just push it a little bit so that we're thinking about this in light of the kingdom. And I thank you so much for your response. Yeah. Thank you.
But, you know, I want to counter, though, a problem I think we have. I don't think we've got as much of a problem in the church of favoring the wealthy. I think most pastors run away from the wealthy. We're afraid to be with the wealthy because we know what happened when Jesus picked the richest guy in the crowd to go home with. Jesus picked Zacchaeus. He didn't pick the poor people. He picked the richest guy. He said, I must go home with you. Now, for whatever reason, Jesus knew you need me tonight more than anybody else. But he was the wealthiest dude in the crowd. And it said after that, the crowd mumbled and grumbled and wasn't really pleased. He was a tax collector and he was wealthy and they didn't much care for that. And most of us pastors shy away from people of wealth who need Jesus just as much as the poor people do. Because we're afraid of the mumbling that may stop. Oh, I saw him having lunch with, and so he's cuddling up to the wealthy. May well be trying to deal with this person's soul. It may be harder for that guy to get into heaven than the poor one. The eye of the needle. So, but bottom line is, being ignorant doesn't help anybody. It's better to know something than to guess. So know what they give. Know how they attend church. Know how they're in mission. Know everything you can, and you can make better pastoral decisions than trying to guess. Guessing's never a good deal. Okay.
Yes.
Hello, Nathan Hunter, and the question that I have pairs with the previous panel conversation as relating to our global obligations as a church. And in speaking,
That's not me.
how does what we say by not giving to the global church as funds speak to the testimony of what we as the church are doing, and how can we better speak to that in faith? Because if we're asking congregation people to give in faith out of their tithe, and yet we as the local church aren't willing to say that, what kind of testimony do we speak to that, and would you speak into that?
Exactly.
This is not statistical. This is when I was pastoring 10 years ago. First decision I made, bivocational, biprofessional, was that we were going to be not only paying our budgets, but we were going to be a 10% church. And we did that. This is a church, I got a unanimous call to go to that church. All 10 people voted for me. And while I was there, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. Gives you some idea of the history of the church, okay? But we made up our minds. They agreed with me. We were going to be a 10% church. And we made it that year and actually did well enough that at the end of the year, and I use this as an example for the church, so you get a testimony. The air conditioner broke. And air conditioners are expensive, even for a church that only runs, well, by then we were running 15, 20. Even for a church that small, air conditioner is expensive. We were able to replace what needed to be replaced without dipping into anybody else's pocket. God had given us the resources during that year while we were being faithful, paying our obligations elsewhere. I used that as the incentive, so to speak, or an incentive when I spoke to the congregation in the coming years about how God was being faithful to us as we were being faithful for our own outreach to the larger world.
So as Wesleyan Arminians, we believe in the total self-surrender and the disinterested love that motivates the heart of Christ to give his all for us, that should motivate us to give ourselves to him in every aspect of our lives. I'm wondering if we are missing out today and not developing that part of our theology, that the issue of self-surrender and disinterested love, when it is shown to others, because we live in a world where money makes the world go round, that we need to, instead of trying to convince people of the value of giving, that we emphasize what we believe and what we experience in our theology, that we are motivated to do this because we live that way for Christ.
Are you suggesting somehow that we ought to function as a church theologically?
And that would then mean that we need to take a real hard look at the vocabulary that came out of the church growth movement, which was all what was going on when I was sitting in these pews as a student. And we need to begin to re-speak the words carefully. In our district, South Central Ohio, we're trying to move away from the word church as much as we can in our vocabulary, because the word church to so many people, especially those that we're winning, that Christ is winning to himself through the people on our district. Church is a building, it's air conditioners, it's a pastor's salary, it is new carpet, it is all of that stuff. And begin to talk about congregations instead of churches. And begin to talk about souls. Begin to talk about all of Wesley's discussion about the world is my parish, that we are a family of congregations. We are a people that is sold out in desperate love to others because of Christ's love for us. And we give not because we have a program or apportionments, but we give because we are compelled to give as we walk deeper with Christ. And our pastors need to reconnect that kind of speaking, that kind of vocabulary in their preaching in a way that is much more, dare I use the word, systematic than what I think we have gotten away from since the 80s and the 90s.
Cliff, that speaks well to the kind of approach you advocate.
I think
in
he's
your
got it.
books. Yeah.
He's got it. Absolutely. It's amazing to me. One of the books I have out here is called Rich Church, Poor Church, where we compared those who really had very solid stewardship records. As I said, a rich church is one that has all the mission and all the money they need to focus on mission and ministry, versus a poor church, which is a church that wakes up every day looking for money. One of the characteristics was that in the rich church, we see them focusing on Jesus all the time. Jesus is the reason we're doing what we're doing. In the poor church, their language is church. We're doing this for the church. And another, it's Jesus. The Jesus one works. That communicates. The church part is what people have rejected. They no longer want to just prop up what they see as historic structures and on and on. They're looking to be a part of Jesus. What you said.
I was resonating earlier with what Megan was saying as a pastor, and I have to confess, I pastored about 20 years, but it's been 16 years out of pastoral ministry now. But I resonate with what she's saying in terms of the formation of the community. And in the forming of community, it's not, we're going to talk about stewardship now, or now we go into a series on giving. And I think there's a spiritual side, there is this faith and foolishness side of this that, as I'm reflecting on my own pastoral experience, God was at work in the congregation in those moments where there was special opportunity to respond by giving, but it was not, it was what was going on in developing us as a community, developing us as the people of God, forming us in generosity and in many other ways. A couple of examples. I talked about the property that we bought, and that was something we didn't expect, and we had to really kind of hit it harder than we usually do in terms of, God's forming us as the people of God. This opportunity is here, and now we've got something we got to do that we're not sure how to do it, but we're going to have to respond to it. And so as we're talking about the value of that building in terms of the transforming of lives and the transforming of this community, on the Sunday morning when we're really focusing on this in our response, a young lady walked into the back of the sanctuary, sat in the back. She'd been a part of that church as a little girl. And she comes in on this Sunday, having been gone for years. And I followed her enough to know far away from God in those years. And I'm sitting up here looking back as she's walking in and sitting down and thinking, Lord, why did you bring her here today? I thought it was foolish. She called the office later that week and made an appointment to come and meet with me. And she sits down and she says, Pastor Dan, I gave my life to Jesus on Sunday. And I said, tell me what you heard in the worship and the message. And she described Jesus speaking to her in ways that were not a part of that worship or the sermon notes. Had a young couple, new Christians. They hear all this and they said, what can we do? New Christians. And earlier they talked to me about the fact that they had a used car they really needed to sell for some obligations in their household. And when we took the special offering, these new Christians, we get the offering, and the people that gather the offering come to me and they said, Pastor Dan, these were in the offering plate. A set of car keys were in the offering plate. And I look back on that now as a pastor, and I think, there was foolishness going on. But there was such a sense of faith in the forming of people and the willingness to connect generosity and stewardship with how God is forming me, having grown up in the church, and forming this young lady who comes back into the fellowship, and forming this brand new young couple who are new to this. So I guess there are ways to think about this, but deep down, it's a sense in which, as pastors, we call our people day by day to be formed as a community of faith and as the transforming presence of God as his kingdom here in this community. And out of that comes the stewarding of the resources he provides us. It's not just dependent on you and me figuring this out. God is at work in ways that we don't see until we look, and she's in the back of the room, and she comes in on Tuesday and says, you know what God was about on Sunday? Then we know God was at work. It was foolish, but there's a sense in which the faith of that young woman in that congregation transformed another life.
Let me just jump in. You were talking about our sense of obligation, and I think it relates to what you were just saying and Trevor was saying about our theology. Is it an obligation? I don't think it's an obligation. It's an opportunity. And as long as we keep using words like obligation or tax, it's from such a negative place of I have to do this. And instead, there's just such incredible joy in getting to do this. And I don't think you want me to start with my missionary stories, but let me just say, over and over again, watching God provide at just the right moment has just been such an incredible faith builder. And I think that somehow we've thought talking about money is a non-spiritual thing. God is working in terms of shaping people's lives and being good stewards of everything that God has given to them. And if we don't talk about that, we're not even giving people the opportunity to grow in that way. I would say something else that I did learn, I had a lot of time as a missionary and traveling this country, and we used to wonder how we would fund the work over in Russia, and yet God was constantly providing. And I'm going to echo with the fact that one thing I was very uncomfortable with was being with really wealthy people, because I'd never spent time with really wealthy people in my life. And I remember the scripture thinking about, I've learned whatsoever state I am in therewith to be content, whether in plenty or not. And I knew that some days maybe I would spend time with somebody that was really wealthy, and the next day I'm just as comfortable hanging out with somebody that has nothing. I think that's part of our call as well. How do I live into that and minister at all of those levels? And all of those people need an opportunity to feel like they are special in the sight of God.
Our conversation so far has been, as we would anticipate, about income and dollars and culture and telling story. Of course, it's first and foremost, before you can tell the story, you have to have the story. I am also concerned about another area of stewardship, and that is our attitude towards the gift that God has given us in our clergy. We believe in a God called clergy. We want a God called clergy. That's right. And I think as we enter into a financial mindset within churches, we too often move over into the idea that in order to be good stewards, we have to get a good deal out of those we hire. And so we think of what we pay our clergy as exemplifying good stewardship if we can get more for less. That's not what we say we believe. If we believe that God calls people, gifts them, and gives them back to the body as leaders, that is not getting a good deal to hire somebody. That's a responsibility to steward a gift that's been given to us. And I think that when we really catch the stewardship vision in whatever expression of the body of Christ we have, we will take more seriously caring for those God has called and given to us. And I think another one of the leading indicators of a change will be when we see that kind of a change in the attitude towards how we care for those whom God has called, gifted us with, and we will be concerned about the stresses they face financially and whether or not they're prepared for retirement. Just a thought.
I'm not sure I know how to articulate this, but one of my great concerns is that this is only symptomatic, the loss of 50% of our market share. And my question, I suppose, is can a self-focused people who say they are the people of God, but they're really focused on being the church for themselves, for their own interest, can they be stimulated by the telling of story of the great successes around the world and even in our own congregations, transformed lives, how it's making a difference? Or if they're self-focused and church really is for them, does that really matter? Can a self-focused church be stimulated by some of the methodologies we've talked about today?
Well, I believe anybody can be saved. Some are just harder. Some are just harder than others. Part of the problem that we certainly have in the church that I think you're talking about is that we have said to people for a long, long time, "Well done, good and faithful servant, you got it," when they didn't. And we've grandfathered them in under one set of rules and led them to a false belief that what they experience and what they have is a full life in Christ. And they don't. And that's very, very difficult to overcome when they've spent 30, 40 years in the church. You know, thinking that if they keep up the building and make it nice and get the carpet fixed like they need it and da-da-da-da-da, they've been good church people, but they never got to know Jesus. It's a huge problem. When pastors share with me, I'm in that kind of church. That's what I have gotten out of lead. I tell them that it's almost fruitless for them to bang away at trying to change the culture of those who have been sitting in those pews for all those years. And you can get up on Sunday and say, you all have to start tithing now, and they're going, wait, no. No, I grandfathered in under the 2% clause back in 1974 and, and all that. Where you have to focus is on trying to get permission from those people to communicate a different set of expectations with new people who are coming in. You can work with them. Let their new DNA begin to slowly infuse within that church, and you begin to move them into leadership, that over a period of years, you begin to shift the culture of where they are. But I have found no magic bullet that says, let's all read this book, have this study, do this program, I've got a sermon series, and so shift the culture of a church. That is what you're describing. On the other hand, I would say that we as pastors have no business trying to simply placate that situation. We are not curators of museums. We're servants called to make disciples of Christ. And so we must continue to try to find paths which are extraordinarily difficult if we're trying to do something different than these people who want something else from us. But don't sell out. Don't sell out. Never sell out the mission for money. Don't. And some of us will go to the cross on that. But unless some of us do, the world won't ever really be changed.
Thank you.